Let me just introduce Nicole quickly. So Dr. Nicole Letourneau is the ATTACH study PI and co-creator of the ATTACH intervention, along with Martha Hart. She is a registered nurse, PhD, and fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and American Academy of Nursing. She's a professor in the Faculty of Nursing in the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary, and also holds the Alberta Children's Hospital Chair in Parent-Infant Mental Health, and is the director of Resolve Alberta. She's quite prolific. She has attained more than $20 million in research funding, is the author of 3 books, and has published more than 190 peer-reviewed papers, as well as contributed to a lot of popular media work, including the Huffington Post and Toronto Star. And she's the most followed nurse on Twitter. And she has a ton of honors as well. So she was Canada's Outstanding New CIHR Investigator. She was a top 40 under 40. I could go on. And she is also, on top of all that, the president of the College and Association of Registered Nurses for Alberta. That does not do her justice, but that's the bio that we're going to give her today. So Nicole, I'm going to turn it over to you to get the presentation started.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kara. That definitely did me justice. I appreciate it very much. Everyone can hear me and everyone can see the slide deck? Okay, great. All right, I'll just launch in here then. So thanks so much. I'm delighted to join you today for my CIHR SPOR theme seminar series talk on toxic stress, parent-child relationships, and attachment. The slides. Oh, it is. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So the objectives of my talk today are to describe the definition and underpinnings of parent-infant relationship quality and related concepts, including parent-child interaction, serve and return, attachment and reflective function. Describe how parent-infant relationship quality can impact child health over the lifespan. And describe not only how toxic stressors, for example, parental depression, addictions, and domestic violence, and low income, can undermine child development, but most importantly, how parent-infant relationship quality can buffer the negative impacts of those toxic stressors. So let's talk about parent-infant relationship quality first. And before I launch in, I want to be clear that while I use the term parent or caregiver or mother almost interchangeably in this presentation, I certainly recognize that parents may be of many different types of people to children. But where does parent-child relationship quality fit into our understanding of what impacts health? So in my view, parent-child relationship quality underpins some of the important determinants of health, specifically social support, healthy child development, and individual capacity and coping skills, which are important determinants of health. Parent-child relationship quality is improved when parents have adequate social support that enables them to have the emotional and physical energy they need to interact with their children in sensitive and responsive ways that ultimately promotes their children's development. And by supporting parents professionally or personally, we can build parents' capacity to have optimal parent-child relationships. So social support in combination with the parental capacity for optimal parent-child relationships ultimately underpins healthy child development as a determinant of population health. So now that we see where parent-child relationship quality fits in terms of the determinants of health, let's talk about what parent-child relationship quality is exactly. And according to Catherine Barnard, who is a pioneering nurse researcher in this field, parent-child relationship quality is the product of 3 influences, which she described in her child health assessment model. These include characteristics of the environment and the resources available, caregiver characteristics, including physical and mental health, coping and education, and child characteristics, including the child's temperament or degree of fussiness or easiness to care for, and regulation of the child, or the child's ability to modulate their reactions to stimuli, like hunger or fatigue. And children born preterm or with colic, for example, often present with challenges in self-regulation. And in the case of the colicky child, for example, these children may struggle to self-regulate and stop crying in response to soothing by their caregivers. And in the 1970s, believe it or not, we've come a long way. This understanding was groundbreaking because before this point, clinicians and scientists generally attributed child health to the qualities of caregiving. So then it was mothering that was their their conception of caregiving, the mothers were blamed or rewarded, thanked almost exclusively for how their relationships went with their children. And this model that Catherine Barnard proposes suggested that the child had something to do with the quality of the relationship the child had with the caregiver. Barnard went on to describe specific characteristics that caregivers or behaviors that caregivers should do and infants should do in order to have optimal parent-child interactions. Caregivers need to be sensitive to cues, as you can see on the left-hand box. They need to alleviate or respond to their child's distress and provide growth fostering situations, which include social, emotional, and cognitive growth fostering opportunities. And the child in turn needs to give clear cues to the caregiver that the parent can read and be responsive to their caregiver. So for example, soothe in response to parent soothing attempts when the child is crying. And when all is going well, the caregiver-child interaction predicts better cognitive development, language development, social emotional competence, and attachment security. And there is a huge, huge volume of research to show this. So I certainly didn't cite it, that there's just so much. But the breaks in the cycles you can see in the arrows suggest risk factors that predict less than optimal parent-child interactions. And those would be things like the caregiver characteristics of depression, say, or the child characteristics of colic, for example, just going back to our previous slide. So this is an example of parental sensitivity and responsiveness and an infant who is engaged. The infant is signaling, in both the drawing and the picture, clear cues indicating a desire to interact. The arms oriented toward the caregiver, the eyes wide and bright, and the infant is calmly focused and alert, and the caregiver hopefully will promote the child's maintenance of that state. Optimal maternal-child interaction involves being able to help regulate the infant state. And this is also a great example of serve and return, which is essentially the metaphor to explain maternal sensitivity to infant cues. As the infant serves up the cues of smiling and reaching, the mother returns the serve by responding with smiling and talking with her baby. And I wish I could show you these two videos that I have in the box at the bottom of the screen, but I was a little trepidatious with Zoom today, but I urge you to check them out. They're the Harvard Center on the Developing Child's terrific video on serve and return, and the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative's also super video on serve and return. Great little short 2 to 5 minute videos that I urge you to check out. So now that we see the optimal parent-child relationships include interactions that are characterized by sensitive parents or caregivers, what do we mean by sensitivity? And sensitivity, I love this definition by Patricia Crittenden. Sensitivity is any pattern of behavior that pleases the infant and increases the infant's comfort and attentiveness and reduces its distress and or disengagement. So it's any pattern. So you can tell if the caregiver is being sensitive or responsive often because the child is engaged, they're comfortable and attentive, and they're not distressed. Sensitive caregivers are masters of observation of their children. And this can be conscious or unconscious, but in short, they choose the best times to interact with their children and find ways to maintain the infant in the optimal state for interaction. And so these are the states of arousal. Flooded, for example, crying, hyper alert when the child's fussy, calmly focused and alert, hypo alert, drowsy, and asleep. And when the infant is in a calmly focused and alert state with well-paced interactions, the caregiver can help the child maintain the state for a positive interaction. However, when the child is flooded with stimuli, hunger, noise, etc., the child relies on the caregiver to help them return to that calmly focused and alert state by addressing the child's needs. And being sensitive to cues and responding to them, that is using these serve and return interactions to advantage, is what makes for optimal parent-child interactions. So by noticing and responding appropriately to infant cues, parents are regulators of their infant states. And infant responsiveness in each state influences what will occur between the mother and the baby. For example, in the quiet alert state, the baby is awake and calm, just looking around, not fussy, whiny, or unhappy, but will seem to be at peace. And the quiet alert period is when the child is taking in the world around him or her and learning the most about life. And this is conducive to best interactions with the caregiver. Sensitive caregivers will notice that their infant is ready to engage with, for example, as I said, notice the infant's wide, bright eyes and smiling. The caregiver will also notice when the child needs a break, with looking away, squirming, and so forth on the right-hand column here. The sensitive and responsive caregiver will support their infant by addressing the child's needs and trying to help them return to that calmly focused and alert state. The still face paradigm is an example of what happens when the caregiver, and in this case the mother, in this picture here, stops responding to infant cues. In the still face paradigm, the mother is asked to face her child and interact with her baby like she normally would, with smiling and responding with her voice as per usual. Then, for 1 minute, the mother is asked to take on a still face, which is in the bottom left panel of pictures, to not smile. The mother is told to not smile, not to respond or follow her child's gestures, even with her eyes. And that's what's happening in this left-hand panel here. And the reaction is stark. At first, the infant grows more communicative, pointing and making all sorts of sounds, facial expressions, and movements to get the mother's attention again. But when that inevitably fails, because the mother's been told not to respond, the infants generally dissolve into tears, crying, and display many of the signs of distress I just told you about. So in summary, when the caregiver does not engage in the relationship, the interaction, or serve in return, the child is unable to self-regulate, unable to be in that calmly focused and alert state, which undermines their ability to interact with and learn from the world around them in play or social settings, for example. Which brings us to attachment. And I always like to differentiate what I mean by attachment from some of the popular conceptions of attachment. Attachment parenting is a popular cultural take on attachment theory that suggests, for example, you should minimize stressing your child. And so weaning and co-sleeping, for example, can happen until the child decides they no longer need such activities. And that's not what I'm speaking about. I just want to differentiate attachment theory that I'll be speaking about from some of these. And I don't really have a judgment of those, but just this is not what I mean. I'm speaking about attachment as defined by John Bowlby, who I'll speak about in a moment, and his contemporary Donald Winnicott, who's quoted here, saying there is no such thing as a baby. And he goes on to say that a baby alone cannot exist. The full quote is, there is no such thing as a baby. There is a baby in someone, because a baby alone cannot exist. And at the most basic level, this point underscores the essential importance of an infant's attachment to their caregiver in order for them to survive infancy. Attachment behaviors demonstrated by infants are evolutionary adaptations rooted in biology that maintain the proximity of the caregiver to the infant and care from the caregiver to promote the child's survival. John Bowlby described attachment in his 3 books, pictured here on the bottom right, and much of his work resulted from his observations of children separated from their parents for their safety during the London bombings of World War II. He describes attachment as serving to keep the infant close to the caregiver, which he referred to as the mother, to promote their survival. He also described attachment as an emotional, lasting, psychological connectedness between human beings. And finally, he believed, and it's been since borne out by research, that the earliest attachments formed by children with their caregivers have a tremendous impact that continues throughout life. I'll review some of that research later once we fully understand what attachment means and how it's observed. And you can see in the picture here in the lower left corner, John Bowlby on the right, seated next to a woman, and that's Mary Ainsworth, who gifted us with the method we use to assess attachment. I always like to point out too that she completed her doctoral work on attachment at the University of Toronto, so we have a Canadian connection for this really important theory and measurement. So Mary Ainsworth took Bowlby's theory and operationalized it so that we can measure it. 4 important concepts underpin attachment, and these include proximity maintenance to the caregiver, distress on separation, and whether or not the caregiver is able to provide a safe haven from distressing events and a safe haven for exploration. So we use Ainsworth's measure of attachment called the strange situation procedure in our research. To do this, we invite pairs of mothers and their children, so mother and child, into our laboratory, which is set up like a pediatrician's waiting room, with a chair for the mother to sit in and toys for the child to play with. And after about 5 minutes, we ask the mother to leave the child, first with a stranger, and then later on all alone. And we all watch, mother included, through a one-way window, what happens. And we particularly watch when the mother reunites with her child. We can tell by how the child reacts to the parent's return if the child is securely attached, insecurely attached, or unable to establish an organized pattern of attachment. And that pattern, assessed around 12 to 20 months of age, really matters to later health and development. The attachment pattern a child demonstrates reflects whether children have felt security or not, whether or not they feel confident, safe, and secure in the availability and reliability of their caregivers to respond to them. So essentially, parental sensitivity and parental availability are key determinants of secure attachment. And here's another great illustration of the concepts. You can see the secure base and safe haven represented by the parent's hands on the left-hand side. To be a secure base for the child to go out and explore the world socially and physically, the caregiver must watch over the child, delight in and enjoy the child's exploration, and help the child when needed. And to be a safe haven, the caregiver needs to protect, comfort, and delight in the child, and importantly, help organize their feelings. In other words, help them regulate their states. So from our measurement and those of others, we can characterize children's attachment pattern. Type B is secure, and that's the optimal pattern. Unfortunately, most children, about 65%, are secure. Type A and C are insecure, and they represent 10 to 20% of children. And type D is disorganized, representing up to 15% of children. So what do we see with type B children? On reunion with their parent in that strange situation procedure I just spoke about, these children who display secure attachment greet their caregiver with a smile or vocalization and will initiate contact. The child is comforted and can return to play. The caregiver functions as a safe haven from distress, which resulted from the separation they experienced, and the child uses the caregiver as a secure base from which to explore the world socially and physically. And essentially, the separation was the problem. So when the caregiver returns, the child's problem should be resolved, and with secure children it is, and they can get comforted and go back to play. And unfortunately, for children with insecure attachment, who we will discuss next, the caregiver's return does not resolve their problem of the separation. For type A avoidant children, when the caregiver returns, the child shows signs of ignoring, looking, or turning away from the caregiver. The child makes no effort to seek or maintain contact with the caregiver on reunion, and their play may continue throughout, but at a low level. It's either not stimulating or not age appropriate. And for the type C, ambivalent resistant children, when the caregiver returns, the child seeks contact with the caregiver on reunion, then resists contact angrily once achieved. It may look like a struggle, and there is delayed return to play, if at all. So why these strategies? It's understood that type A pattern children minimize awareness of their feelings and do what will be reinforced and or avoid doing what will be punished. For example, a child, even an infant, who's responded to negatively each time he or she cries may develop a type A strategy. And type C pattern children focus on their feelings as guides to behavior, which tend to be demonstrated in the extreme and then reinforced by their caregiver's response. So for example, a child who's ignored by a passive parent unless they act out may develop a type C strategy. So secure attachment, in contrast, predicts a host of positive outcomes. Longitudinal studies have shown there's a strong association between the quality of attachment within a child's first year and subsequent attachment during adolescence and early childhood. For example, secure attachment with a caregiver at age 1 predicted attachment relationships 16 to 18 years later. Major life events like divorce, serious illness, parental death may predict changes in attachment, but all things being equal, attachment is quite stable over time. Secure attachment also predicts more optimal relationships with peers throughout childhood and adolescence, children's social and emotional development, including positive behaviors such as resiliency and curiosity, and self-reliance, self-regulation, and social competence in adulthood, and overall positive mental health. Insecure infant attachment predicts children's externalizing behavioral disorders, for example, aggression, behavioral problems, antisocial behavior, internalizing behavioral disorders such as anxiety and depression, and cognitive and language deficits, and even into adulthood, depression and suicidality, and inflammatory disorders and all-cause disease. And most of the emphasis on attachment research has shown that insecure or disorganized attachment predicts poor mental health over the lifespan. This has been the emphasis as the theory has been mostly examined in psychology or psychiatry. However, more recent studies have examined impacts on broader health outcomes, and I was really amazed to read this study that showed that attachment pattern observed at 12 to 18 months predicted an inflammation-based illness and all types of physical illnesses and even death at 32 years of age. So I always like to pause here, and I'm not sure if we can unmute or you can put it in the chat, but I always like to pause and ask my audience what emotions you see in this child's face. You can type them in the chat. I can't really see the chat. Maybe just shout them out. What emotions do you see in this child's face?
Rose. Yeah, we don't really see much emotion, I guess.
It looks
Oh, maybe
Rose.
flat, maybe? Flat, frozen? Okay.
Yeah,
What do you think about the eyes that are so
big.
big,
So alert or something. I don't know.
hyper alert? Does anybody see fear or anxiety?
Yeah.
on edge.
Yes. Okay.
I would
Right.
say after the fact, it looks like the child has gone through some kind of trauma
Yeah.
and looks almost like he's relieved, but that he hasn't, it looks to me, I think it's a he, I'm not sure. He hasn't calmed down. He's just kind of, oh my gosh, I've just finally, somebody's holding me, but there's not a release of relief.
There's no relief. That's a really great
Yeah.
point. Is that Susanna speaking?
Yes.
Yes, you're very
Yes.
you're very astute. So thanks, Susanna.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's, you've all really hit the nails on the head. I see fear, anxiety, lack of relief, frozen, those sorts of things. And this is a strange picture, and why they put it on the cover of this book, obviously, is because the parent should be the safe haven and the secure base, as I mentioned, particularly safe haven in this situation. But the child is unable to find a safe haven in their primary caregiver in this picture. And that's unusual because the child's proximity to the caregiver should be the solution to the whatever stress or strain they've experienced. The caregiver should be the solution. And when the caregiver is unable to be the solution, not able to be that safe haven, this can lead to disorganized attachment for the child. Where do they turn? Where is their safe haven? So what explains disorganized attachment? The research suggests that primary caregiver stress, trauma, depression, and distress may reduce their ability to help their infant self-regulate. That comes from noticing and responding to their infant's cues. In other words, when mothers are withdrawn, emotionally unavailable, or frightening, this undermines the formation of an organized pattern of attachment. Atypical or anomalous behavior that traumatized parents demonstrate may be frightening to infants. And this does not necessarily mean that the caregiver is doing overtly threatening things. Failure to respond can be frightening for an infant who, as we have seen, relies on his or her parent for survival and, at a more basic level, to self-regulate. Examples of these behaviors that parents can demonstrate are threatening, for example, looming in too close to the infant, being dissociative, for example, speaking with a haunted voice, or being deferential or timid toward the infant. Disrupted communication, for example, lack of response to the infant, or effective communication errors, for example, the mother laughing while the child is distressed, or failing to correct a communication error. Well, what does disorganized attachment predict? So there's a strong association between these atypical caregiving behaviors that we just discussed and disorganized attachment at 12 to 18 months. And there's a strong association between disorganized attachment at 12 to 18 months and later problems, including severe psychopathology, including borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and even schizophrenia. So what are these traumas and stresses that can interfere with maternal behavior, caregiver behavior, and negatively impact children's development? These are what we call the toxic stressors. But there are, and not all stress is toxic, I wanted to emphasize that. There are different levels of stress. There's positive stress, tolerable, and toxic stress. But stress can become toxic when the stress response is activated over a prolonged period, and this is crucial. And there's an absence of protective relationships. In other words, toxic stress is only toxic in the absence of protective relationships. It can become tolerable or tolerated when relationships around the child are supportive. And the key point being that parent-child relationships, sensitive and responsive parent-child interactions, high quality serve and return, and/or secure maternal-child attachment can make a toxic stress tolerable. So what are the toxic stressors? The most common are considered to be family violence, parental addictions, and mental health problems. And low income is often considered another. According to the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, in the US, between 75 and 130 of every 1,000 children under 5 years of age live in homes with one of the three precipitants of toxic stress that could negatively affect their development. And we know from Canadian studies that children under 5 are disproportionately represented in homes where there is family violence. And our Canadian statistics on maternal depression are also consistent with these. So let's talk about the example of depression in mothers. Depressed mothers are characterized by less than optimal interactions with their children. And I just want to pause and say, of no fault of their own, it's the illness that's really undermining mom's abilities to be interactive. I do not want to be thought of as ever blaming moms with depression for these things. But this is what can happen just due to the symptoms. Moms could end up having negative perceptions of normal infant behavior. They're less likely to pick up on their infant's cues or respond to their needs. They're less emotionally expressive, less affectionate, more anxious, less sensitive, inappropriate in their interactions. They can be more negative in their play. And they speak more slowly and less often. And depressed mothers in general are characterized by less than optimal interactions with their children. And this is thought to explain why depression is considered toxic to children's health and development. It's so well established that maternal depression negatively impacts attachment that it's difficult to find new studies on the topic. So here we show that infants of mothers who are not depressed are much more likely to be securely attached than infants whose mothers are depressed. That's the large burgundy colored piece of the pie. You also see that more infants are disorganized in the group of infants of depressed mothers. That's the yellow slices of the pie. And we show the same trend in preschoolers. Preschoolers of mothers who are not depressed are much more likely to be securely attached than infants, whose mothers are depressed. And that's again the large burgundy colored piece of the pie. You can also see that many more preschool children are disorganized in the group of preschool children of depressed mothers. That's the yellow slices of the pie. So in cases of insecure attachment, the caregiver is characterized typically as insensitive, disengaged, uninvolved, emotionally flat, and controlling. Infants develop these self-protective strategies, such as avoidance, attention deficit, or acting out, which may be helpful in the moment, but are detrimental often over the lifespan and can lead to behavioral problems. But it's helpful to remember that this insecure attachment is a child's strategy for eliciting protection and comfort from the often uninvolved parent. So they're adaptations. The child is adapted to the caregiver they have. And unfortunately, some of those adaptations don't work so well with other people. So it may be fair to ask whether these common childhood problems that can extend across childhood and into adolescence and adulthood are symptoms of disorder or actually self-protective strategies that emerge in response to parent-child relationship qualities that result in insecure attachment presentations. Now we'll talk about reflective function and how this relates to parent-child relationships, especially attachment. Evaluation suggests that parental reflective function is modifiable. It's great. You can intervene with that. A little hint about attach down the road for our next talk. And this modifiable reflective function can predict improvements in maternal sensitivity, responsiveness, parent-child attachment security, and infant development. So we see that reflective function is related to attachment, and attachment in turn is related to healthy child development. A parent with high reflective functioning has the ability to imagine their child's thoughts, feelings, intentions, and mental states. They are able to perceive the influence of their emotions on their child's mental states, and they see their child as a separate, autonomous individual with a mind of their own. In contrast, low reflective parents attribute their own attitudes and opinions onto the child. Here's an example of a statement from a parent that speaks to low reflective function. The parent was asked, "How do you think your angry feelings affected your child?" The parent responded by saying, I don't think they made him feel bad. I almost guarantee that they almost gave him a sense of accomplishment, like my goal was to irritate him. Here's another example. We asked the parent in one of our studies, have you ever felt that you needed someone to take care of you or to be there for you? And the parent said, sure, yeah. First, I felt like I needed to be taken care of or feeling like I needed some help. And what was that like for you? I don't know. There's an example of low reflective function. And here's an example in contrast of high reflective function. The parent was asked, have you ever felt that you needed someone to take care of you or to be there for you? Yes, the parent says, I was pretty upset that I was having to ask for support. I was frustrated and upset. And then the parent is asked, how did you handle your feelings at that time? Parent says, I expressed them, shared them, and made sure that I shared some ways that my expectations are not really expectations, but needs that could be filled. So I kind of studied the problem and what I needed, and then I made sure that I just took some time to myself. So there's an example of high reflective function, insight into their own thoughts and feelings. And here's an example of insight into the child's thoughts and feelings with high reflective function. Parent is asked, can you tell me about a time that your child felt rejected or left out? And the parent said, I knew she was feeling left out the day that she said she wanted more time with just me. I think she just felt alone. I think it's really hard feeling, no matter what your age. It's especially difficult when you're not able to take care of yourself at all, and you're still dealing with all the, like, there's so much more in childhood. All the feelings just, they're bigger. So I think anything that's good or bad for adults is a lot worse for her. So I think it breaks her anytime there's a little bit, just because they're so much sadder. So this certainly speaks to the insight the mother had into her child's thoughts and feelings, which is high reflective function. Putting it all together, this is how we understand the associations between the various concepts. Beginning at the top, if parents have realistic insights into their child's thoughts, feelings, and mental states, they are likely to have higher reflective function, so going to the right. And then they're more likely to be sensitive and responsive to their infant's or child's cues, going to the bottom right. If they are more sensitive and responsive, they are also more likely to have securely attached children who themselves grow and develop well and have healthy relationships and development, which is the far left. So they in turn are able to have realistic representations of their partners and their child's thoughts, feelings, and mental states. And in this way, in some of our work in Attach that I'll be speaking about in a couple of months, we hope to ultimately have impacts intergenerationally. That's the goal. So let's turn now to some examples from research showing how these various concepts affect children's outcomes. So first, let's see an example of how greater reflective function predicts better cognitive development in young children. Specifically, how parents are hidden regulators of their infants or child states and cognitive development via parent-infant relationship qualities. So these are results of a study that's literally brand new. I just got the results this week. We used a subsample of the APRIN cohort. It was 75 mothers with whom we conducted interviews and administered questionnaires to assess their reflective function when their children were 3 to 5 years of age. We also assessed the children's cognitive development via the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence test around the same time. The turquoise rows, this is the variables on the far left, the P, R, F, Q, and the PDIs. Those are our measures of reflective function. You can see that reflective function, wherever there's a bold coefficient under Model 1, Model 2, Model 3, in either verbal comprehension or working memory, wherever there's a bolded coefficient, that shows there's an association between the parent's reflective function and the child's performance on this measure of intelligence, particularly in the areas of verbal comprehension and working memory. And incidentally, you can also see that the attachment patterns, D not D, just below the turquoise rows, which signifies disorganized attachment, and B not B, just below that, signifying secure attachment, also correlated with children's verbal comprehension and working memory. And so right now, doctoral student Jelena Komenchuk, who I think is on the call, hi Jelena, is working on writing up these findings for publication. Pretty excited about these. So now we will see how parents are hidden regulators of infant and children's states and behavior and endocrine system via parent-infant-child relationship qualities. The findings I'll speak about are in this paper entitled Cortisol Patterns of Depressed Mothers and Their Infants Are Related to Maternal-Infant Interactive Behaviors. To understand these findings, you need to know a little more about the HPA or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This HPA axis secretes cortisol, which is a steroid stress hormone, via pulsations that follow a 24-hour circadian profile. We call this the diurnal rhythm. You can see that the cortisol in the far left picture, suns and the moons, you can see the cortisol is highest in the early morning and drops down over the course of the day. And stressors like exposure to maternal depression stimulate the activation of the HPA, which triggers the release of cortisol from the adrenal gland. In high doses, though, cortisol is neurotoxic. If cortisol damages the hypothalamus, then over time it becomes a vicious cycle of ever-increasing cortisol production and thus more hypothalamus damage, the catch-22. The hypothalamus is the functioning center of the brain's most powerful hormones, or neurotransmitters, that affect the mind: serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine. Hypothalamus has been called the brain of the brain. The hypothalamus controls hunger, thirst, fatigue, and sleep. And interestingly, hypothalamus damage has been related to mood and behavioral problems and obesity. Overactivation of the HPA system is related to decreases in brain volume, inhibition of neurogenesis, disruption of neuronal plasticity, and abnormal connectivity of the synapses in the brain. And at extremes, in cases of extreme neglect, this is very extreme neglect, as seen in these brain images, persistently elevated cortisol from chronic stress, likely in combination with lack of stimulation, is demonstrated by changes in brain size. This is essentially the mechanism that explains how the toxic stressors are indeed toxic to development. So further, frequent overactivation of this system can result in maladaptive responses to stress. Because cortisol at high levels is considered neurotoxic, it destroys neurons, as we just saw, but can also negatively affect the function of bodily organ systems. As high cortisol is associated with physical problems such as increased insulin resistance, obesity, and diminished immune responses. Also, prolonged exposure to elevated cortisol is linked to fear behaviors and hypervigilance. Over the long term, altered cortisol patterns have been associated with reduced cognition and memory, attentional difficulties, poor self-control, and behavioral problems in children. So, going back to our study, we wanted to know if higher quality maternal-child interaction would short-circuit this feedback loop, reducing stress in the infants and thus reducing HP activation in the infants who are in the care of a sample of mothers with depression. In our study, we actually looked at a variety of factors that predicted the cortisol levels of the infants of the depressed mothers, including difficult life circumstances, marital adjustment, low income, depression, severity, and infant characteristics like preterm birth, birth complications, and NICU admission. So what did we find? As a validity check, on average for moms, through the solid line, we found that their diurnal pattern was as expected, it was high in the morning and dropped down over the day. But for the babies, the infants, we observed a flattened afternoon decline. This means there was more cortisol in the infants. When we looked at it in more detail, we examined how maternal-child interaction quality affected the infant's cortisol. We found that the depressed mothers who had less than optimal interactions with their babies had babies who experienced less decline in their cortisol over the day, shown here by the blue line. In other words, mothers who touched and smiled at their infants less or showed less enjoyment in their infant had babies whose cortisol stayed higher over the day. The infants whose mothers had better quality interactions then had a greater decrease in cortisol, shown by the red line. We also observed that children whose mothers who provided more cognitive growth fostering experiences in their interactions, like using rich language, providing feedback on behaviors, so being sensitive and responsive to their behaviors, explaining concepts and so on, had lower overall cortisol concentrations over the day. In other words, the mothers who interacted best with their children, depicted by the far left blue bar, had infants with the least amount of cortisol over the day. So as I mentioned, we actually had looked at a variety of factors that predicted the cortisol levels in the infants of depressed mothers, including difficult life circumstances, marital adjustment, low income, depression, severity, and infant characteristics, and so on. However, the only thing that mattered was the parent-child interaction quality. That was the only thing that predicted cortisol levels in the infants in this study. So I have another example from our research on how parents are hidden regulators of their infants' or child's states and behavior and endocrine system via parent-child relationship qualities. And this comes to the paper entitled Biological Embedding of Perinatal Social Relationships and Infant Stress Reactivity. The lead author is Jenna Thomas, who was a trainee of Jared Giesbrecht and I. In this study of a subsample of 272 mothers and their infants from the APRIN cohort study, we first examined the impacts between social support during pregnancy and maternal-infant interaction quality when babies were 6 months of age. We found that the association between social support in pregnancy from a partner or other close relationship did not have a direct impact on maternal-infant interaction quality at 6 months of age, but rather an indirect impact through depression. In other words, we found that higher social support during pregnancy reduced the likelihood of mother's depression during pregnancy, and further, that greater depression reduced the quality of mother-child interactions. So what we would expect. Then we went on to explore how these variables, these experiences, impacted infants' cortisol. We wanted to see how the social support, maternal depression, mother-infant interaction all work together to predict infants' cortisol at 6 months of age. This time, we looked at how reactive the child's HPA or cortisol response was to a stressor at 6 months of age. Essentially, we kept the child from reaching a toy that they wanted, so we frustrated the child. We were nice to them. We found this time that high social support predicted reduced depressive symptoms, and higher depressive symptoms reduced the quality of mother-child interaction, and that higher quality mother-child interaction in turn reduced infants' cortisol reactivity. So in the context of social support and depression, maternal-infant interaction really seemed to make a difference in reducing that infant's cortisol. at 6 months of age. So I hope I've convinced you that along with being hidden regulators of their infants or child's states, behaviors, parents also regulate their child's endocrine systems. Now I'll show you an example of how parents also regulate their children's immune systems via parent-infant-child relationship qualities. The findings I will speak about are in this paper entitled Maternal Sensitivity and Social Support Protect Against Childhood Atopic Dermatitis. First, you need to know a little bit about atopic dermatitis. It's a skin condition that makes the skin red and itchy. It's common in children and infants and tends to flare up periodically. And importantly, any kind of skin condition is called or any kind of allergic condition is called an atopy. Atopic dermatitis is called part of the atopic march, or march from atopic dermatitis through to allergic rhinitis, which is like a runny nose, through to asthma. So children who have atopic dermatitis are more likely to go on to have asthma. And it's a big red flag for allergy specialists and that sort of thing, that this child might be at risk for asthma when they present with atopic dermatitis. And it's thought that neural and endocrine responses that result from stress drive immune responses in the infants toward the development of atopic dermatitis and ultimately asthma. So in this study, we used another subsample of data from the APRIN cohort on 242 mothers and their children. We assessed the quality of mother-child interaction around 6 months of age, and then assessed atopic dermatitis around 18 months of age. We found that the more sensitive and responsive the mothers, the less the risk of atopic dermatitis. So that is depicted in the left-hand graph. You can see that among the sample of children with sensitive mothers on the far right of that left-hand graph, 0.4%, or only about 1 of the children, had atopic dermatitis. And you compare this to nearly 25% of the kids whose mothers were coded as insensitive, which is the far left dark red bar. But 25% of the kids whose mothers were coded as insensitive in their interactions with their children had atopic dermatitis. So 0.4 to nearly 25%. We also found, if you look at the far right graph, that mothers who were low in unresponsiveness, so actually quite responsive to their infants, had fewer infants with atopic dermatitis. So the green bar here is the positive parent-child interaction quality, where mothers are rated as low unresponsive, in other words, high responsive, and those children are fewer of them being raised by mothers with higher responsivity, atopic dermatitis. So I hope I convinced you that along with being hidden regulators of their infants or child's states, behaviors, and endocrine systems, parents also regulate their infants' immune systems through the quality of parent-child interaction they have. So parent-child relationships are pretty important. And that concludes my presentation. I also wanted to thank my many team members and colleagues who've helped with this work and our many funders. And I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Nicole. A wonderful talk as per usual. If you could put your questions into the chat box, that would be, there we go. I'm just doing a quick scroll to see if what's already in here. And while people are collecting their thoughts, Nicole, I am kind of sad that we're not going to be having the attach talk next month, just because it's so logically from what you just talked about, but I think you deserve a month off, absolutely.
I specifically didn't talk about the attach results. This, I had a little teaser there, but the modifiable nature reflective function, which is what we're addressing in the attach intervention. But I will talk about the results of the attach pilots and exciting work in 2 months.
Okay, so stay tuned, everyone. Okay, so first question. Because these studies are typically done with one caregiver, do we understand the impact of the second caregiver's parenting on child outcomes?
Really good question. Well, the first thing to say is children have different relationships with each caregiver. and you can see a different attachment pattern with each caregiver. So that's been established. But the importance of that second caregiver, whether it's a partner or family member or friend, whoever's co-parenting that child, they can really buffer the impacts of whatever stress the primary caregiver is experiencing on that child. So I think that's just an important thing to mention, that the importance of social support just cannot be overstated. And there is some work on like things like triadic attachment and how family structures work together to provide environments, interactive environments for children and promote their development. We haven't been doing that in our team, and it's hard work to do, to be honest. So we haven't really emphasized it beyond the social support component, which I just mentioned.
Well, and a follow-up to that question too, and I hear this at a lot of different talks, especially where parenting is concerned. There's a lot of dads out there that are like, I'm not chopped liver, like I am contributing to my child. But normally we talk about mom. So do you see evidence that might be like a generational thing, or is there evidence that maybe fathers are coming more online now that parenting has been changing over the last couple of decades?
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think that the fathers, mothers, whoever's that primary caregiver, I think that you would see a lot of the same, we tend to focus because of funders. They sort of want us to, tell us your sample and stick with it. Don't mix mothers and fathers and trans or grandparents. Like they don't want us to mix up their primary caregivers. But I would think Bowlby would say, and Ainsworth would say that it's the primary caregiver, whatever gender, sex, or whatever they are, as long as they do these things, as long as they can read and respond to cues, help regulate infant states, promote secure attachment, it doesn't matter what their chromosomes say, or if they're one generation or two generation removed. I think that's plain. When it comes to families where most of the research is done on primary caregiver families where the primary caregiver is mom. Like most research for a long time it's been done, and we're more and more trying to include fathers. And in fact, our own research has been looking at dads. But what's interesting so far, and this might be a little controversial, but so far we've seen that dads seem to make the biggest impact, especially in infancy, to the quality of support they provide to caregivers. Other than that, what we have seen is fathers don't have much of a direct impact in infancy, except for how they support the parenting. It seems as though, and this is not my research, but others, it seems as though fathers do start to make a bigger difference in children's lives directly as the children grow. And as children, needed to explore and maybe do a little bit slightly more risky things, fathers definitely seem to start to come into their own in terms of how important they are to development. I certainly think they're important. Just that our own research on infants so far has not shown a lot, except for through the social support they provide to moms. We have found some interesting things, though, in that fathers' experiences of adversity in their own childhood can change their child's epigenetic expression. We don't really understand the mechanism for that, but I mean, it just goes, the point being that dads are important. Their dads are important. And we're just starting to really explore in what ways now.
Thank you. Okay, next question. I want to make sure we get to all these. In regards to parents regulating their children's immune systems, do you have any more research planned on that front? And that's a loaded question because I know the answer is yes.
Yeah, you could talk about that, Kara. That's why, well, it's one of the many reasons we have Kara on our team. It's just her thing, psychoneuroimmunology, right? And I don't want to be a spoiler and tell you about the exciting findings that are coming out of the ATTACH program, but definitely we are interested in this. In another study that we have that I didn't even speak about, but it's called VidKids. It's a program for mothers with depression, and we're working to help them be optimal partners and serve return with their babies. That's our goal in that program. One of the outcomes is to look at atopic dermatitis in the kids. So, and we're also looking at the epigenetics of the children to see if their gene expression is changing. And I'm sure Kara will have an interest to see if whatever genes change, if they do map onto immune function. So absolutely, yes, we have a lot of work planned in that area. And I think Kara, you picked the right area to go into because there's so much exciting work to be done here. I think the inflammation is what explains how, it's not a mechanism to explain. I talked about the HPA, but I think that the immune function is another mechanism to explain how stress gets under the skin to negatively affect some people for their lives. I think it's HPA and immune. So we're definitely looking at that more.
We will. And I see I've been notified that there's a hand up, Serena. Oh, Serena has it in the, okay, never mind.
I can't see anybody, so thanks, Kara, for fielding all these.
No worries. So I have another question then. How does this theory affect autism development in children?
Oh, that's such a great question. It's controversial, actually. I mean, I have read some, you know, some of my best colleagues, like Lane Strathern. He's a pediatrician. He was at Baylor in the U.S. Now he's running a big center. I think in Ohio now. He thinks the maternal-child interaction is a big predictor of autism. And I've read, and there was a very interesting study a few years ago that showed that an early intervention for parents who had a child who was already diagnosed or at risk, their child, the index child, was at risk of autism for some reason. And when they delivered this early Head Start intervention to the parents, I could find the citation. Whoever asked the question is interested, and I could provide it to you. I just can't think of the author at the moment. But they found that this early intervention that was designed around helping parents be more sensitive and responsive in a really intense way, like more than just day to day that we would do with that we would do in our own interventions. Very intense, many hours a day work. They reduced the risk. They reduced the likelihood these kids went on to go have autism in the treatment group compared to the control. It was quite profound. And a few years ago, as a result of that, a group at the Alberta Children's Hospital approached me, and they wanted to get funding for something we didn't get funding for. Maybe I should go back and revisit it. But their question was based on an observation they had. They had kids who were on the waiting list to get treatment for, they were the pediatrician or whomever had recommended they go to the Child Development Center because they thought they had autism or they needed to be suspect, autism, they needed to be seen. And there was a waiting list for this program. And while they were on the waiting list, the nurses and whomever decided to provide something to these families because it was quite a long wait, a year. And they found that the kids who got these programs around supporting parenting didn't go on to need any assessment for autism any longer. They said that they cured autism. Like, this is their quote. We think we're curing autism. These kids hadn't been diagnosed. They were at risk and they were, but this is a local, anecdotal, observational event that was, we tried to get some funding for. But I think in the whole field of autism research, like I was speaking with a very well-educated MD, PhD person studies autism, and she didn't know about how attachment might relate to autism. I was surprised. So in the medical community, it's not really broadly considered.
It's a hard question to ask, Nicole. That was my question because I've had the response where my little kiddo has been diagnosed with mild autism, but he has made such changes over the last period of time because I am continuing working with this attachment work that a lot of them are like, wow, he's seeming less and less autistic. And I think it's because, I know there's a neurological connection between the condition that may exist in the genes and to what we do in the environment. And it just, the connection in the genes might still be there, but the behaviors change and their ability to cope in their environment changes. And it's a hard one. I just wanted to know because obviously I'm doing everything I can to help
Keep doing
my little guy, and it's seeming to help. His language has come forward. He's making eye contact, and I know what you mean about hypersensitivity. You have to sort of realize these kids may have we might call it autism, but it's a hypersensitive nervous system, immune system, body type. It's almost like they're a little bit, I don't want to say the word primitive, but their body is so sensitive that if you're not attuned to that level of sensitivity, you can get them to shut down. And if you are really attuned to their sensitivity, you get them to open up. And they're just anyways, that's what I wanted to know because it is a big area of question behind how much do we impact this condition. And people want to feel like there's empowerment to do something, but also not that they're being told if I'm not doing it right, I'm creating autism. So it's a very
very fine balance, Yeah, and there is evidence certainly that certain kids are more at risk genetically, right? There is that, but you know, but maybe the environment has a role to play in tipping the balance in your child's favor. And I certainly don't think that noticing and responding and trying to regulate your child, there's really no downside. Maybe you get a little tired, you know, but there's really no downside. Right?
This is Deb.
Oh, hi, Deb. Oh, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this.
I think with the related to autism, we all know that the earlier the intervention is, and you know, the better the kids do. And we know that all kids, no matter with what developmental disorder, that they may initially be diagnosed, a significant proportion of it, whether it's ADHD or autism or developmental coordination disorder or even reading disabilities, they can grow out of it. And that's all due to environmental factors, the input, the therapies, the parental involvement, all those things make a difference. So just because a child may initially be diagnosed with a disorder does not mean that they will have or meet those criteria for that disorder, or that disorder is a lifelong thing. I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, thanks,
That's
Deb.
all I'm saying.
It's great to have Deb here. This is her expertise, so lovely. I didn't notice you on the list, Deb, so I'm glad you chimed in. Thanks.
Well, actually, this question and Deb's response segues nicely into the last question, which is around, are the positive effects of healthy attachment, what happens if attachment starts off unhealthy? Is there like a critical window that you can undo these negative effects or improve attachment? Like, what is that window of intervention there?
Yeah, that's a great question. It kind of goes what Deb was just saying too. You know, these things are modifiable, and I think I said that attachment was stable over time, but only if the environment is stable over time. So you can see changes in attachment that react to changes in the environment. You know, the relationships that the child has. You know, even in adolescence. So, to my knowledge, it's highly plastic, and you know, it's not something that obviously early life seems to be very important, like 0 to 6 is very important, but later experiences are also important. You know, it's not until you get into your like late 20s where there's diminishing return of impacts of intervention, that kind of thing, on a variety of outcomes. So I would guess that attachment's is similar, and there's always opportunity to intervene and support and help.
Well, I think that's all of our questions then, and we're almost like exactly at 1 o'clock. So perfect timing, everyone. I'm going to stop us there. So thanks again, virtual online applause for Nicole. Thank you for the wonderful talk. And we're going to be again posting this on the attached website, and we'll be emailing the link to everyone on the group as soon as that's up and running. But yeah, so next month we are going to be talking about the immune and biological side of the attached study. So blood sample collection, gene expression, and epigenetics. So if you're interested in the immunological side, stay tuned for that. We'll be talking about that in April. I can't believe it's already April, but thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great.
Yes, so well done, Nicole. Excellent presentation. I never get tired of hearing it. So it's was really
you
nice
could
to-
deliver.